Welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. You know, longtime listeners of this podcast will know that one of my themes is that skills you learned at Fair can be helpful in other aspects of your life. My guest today, Deborah Doyle, will talk about that. But first, Deborah gets the traditional Fair Folk at Work first question, which is, who is the person who said to you there was this thing called fair, and what did they say to get you out there?
My cousin, a Catholic priest, when I arrived in California, said, "There's this place we have to go." And I had just arrived from Virginia, and I loved Williamsburg, loved the notion of living history. Not that I knew what it was. About 2 weekends after I landed in California, he said, "Let's go." And we walked up and saw the year signs go back in time. And Will Wood came out and charmed me and kissed my hand. And I thought, this is a place I want to be. That's how I got there.
What were your first impressions of fair that made you want to come back?
People were so friendly and so interesting. And the costumes, of course, were fabulous. I was there early enough to see The Boys in the Trees, and I was young and I was single and loved the acting. I was an actor in Virginia. I thought it was really an amazing place. And so I continued to visit for a number of years, but I didn't have a car and I lived in San Francisco and I had no idea that there was public transportation or that other people were in fact coming and performing at the fair who lived in San Francisco. So it was always a treat for me for the summer to come up and for me to go to the fair.
Who was the person who said to you, you can work here? And how did that conversation come about?
A woman that I worked with had quit our company because she lived in Fairfax and it was a long drive into the city. And so she had gone to work for Rosie Eckelmeyer. And so my friend said, "Well, I know you love the fair, and Rosie looks for people who can work at Rosie's Posies. So come on in and we can work the show and then we can run around and have fun for the rest of the day." So I went to work for Rosie. And then I also discovered the Friends of the Fair. And so I helped with that garden and that sort of thing. But Rosie was my entree.
Before we go down the fair rabbit hole, can you talk to me about your pre-fair theatrical experience?
Sure. In high school, I was in dramatics, and then I went to the University of Virginia and studied rhetoric and drama. And then I also studied in New Orleans. I studied radio and television and film production and thought that I might be a writer or a producer or a director. And none of those things actually happened, although I did work at Dolby Laboratories and I worked in the film department. So, we were on the road a lot. So entertainment and theater has always been interesting. And then I've also done some in a small theatrical company in the Bay Area while I have been doing fair work as well. So
If I had asked you in your Dolby era, who do you want to be as a director?
oh, what a good question. Um we had experience with auteurs,
Hmm.
people who and I think I would not be an auteur. I think I would be more collaborative. So that is a really good question. Dan, I may have to come back to that.
Are you the first theater person in your family?
I come from a small town in Nebraska. Mercifully, we moved very quickly. But my grandfather, my dad's dad, was the leader of the town band. He was also a state senator. And my dad was also in the band and and my mother liked to direct things, so I had theatrical and performance on both sides.
So when you told them that you were doing theater and going out to the fair, hands were not raised in outrage.
Well, I have to say that when I said I wanted to major in drama and rhetoric, they weren't wildly pleased, but they also knew that I'd find a job somewhere. And then I moved to California before they moved out to California, and they lived in Southern California. They lived in Redlands, so I dragged them to Southern Fair. And so they saw what I was involved with. They were overwhelmed, I think, but also we moved around a lot and they were very flexible. And my mom was a fabulous teacher and saw all these young kids who were really enjoying themselves doing arts and entertainment. And I think she was very pleased that then I went up north and did it someplace else.
Um, Sort of, if you could trace for me, once you started working at the Posey booth, what your day at Fair would be like, what you like to do. Many people sort of remember the smells or the feelings of certain things at Fair, and I'd kind of like to get your take on what were your favorite booths, that kind of thing.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting. When I went to Williamsburg in Virginia, there was a specific summer smell, a bush, and I don't know what it was. But every time I went to Williamsburg, I smelled this bush. And I returned to Williamsburg this year, and it was not in the summertime, and I didn't smell that smell. And it did not feel like my Williamsburg somehow, even though it was wonderful to be there and wonderful to see the craftspeople and all. So for the Renaissance Fair, for especially Black Point, which is where I spent most of my time. The fact that there was music everywhere and that there was music always, I think was an amazing thing to me. I've always loved music and sing, but I also love the quiet parts of the show. I mean, I loved going up to the end of the world, but I also liked the center of the universe because then you could see everybody who marched through. So you could see as they took a left, you could see as they took a right. And I was fortunate enough when I was in the Friends of the Fair, we were doing our gardening. It was a little farther up than the center of the universe, but we were up on top of a hill, and so you could watch everything going on. You didn't have to always be in the sun, which was nice. And I have to say, and you may or may not want to include this, but when I was doing fair in the beginning, it was a great opportunity. And, even when I was a customer, it was a great opportunity to go in and have a bunch of beers. And so I developed a drinking problem. And I got sober. I remember going off to rehab, waving because the fair had already started, and I was waving, and I knew that my life was over. But I've been sober now for 31 years, so so I managed to make it back to fair.
Well, congratulations. Now, one of my common questions that I ask, and this is in regards to the difference between Fair and Williamsburg,
Mhm.
is that one of my thesis is that Fair is a very bottom-up experience. Patrons and customers are immersed, sort of intermingled with the people who are being Elizabethan, as opposed to places like Williamsburg or Disneyland, where the audience is passive and things are presented to them. So compare and contrast your experience at Williamsburg versus the fair.
I agree with what you're saying. However, especially this year, my friend and I, who was also a performer, arrived. It was a kind of a gray day, and it was also at the beginning of their season. And so we saw one character. We saw George Mason was the only character really that we saw. And so most of the people that we saw were third person interpreters, or they were craftspeople. And so there was no attempt while they had costumes on and they were doing wonderful work, there was no attempt to be an actor. There was no attempt to be a character. There was also no music in the streets. So there were tourists, there was us, and then there were the people who were doing the work, who were making the wigs, the perukes, the whatever. And also then when we had lunch, we looked out of the tavern and they were trying to do oh my goodness, the revolution is coming and that sort of thing. But there were about three characters who also had been not performers. So they've sort of switched roles from I'm making a thing to I'm an actor now. I'm trying to get people to be excited. And in fact, we went to the Williamsburg Visitor Center and said, you really need some actors out there. you, really, you really need to merge the Renaissance Fair activities with the wonderful work that you're doing. And I know it'd be wildly expensive, and they've probably tried it in the past. And, I haven't been I won't tell you how many years it's been since I've been to Williamsburg. And they're really trying to pay attention to diversity. And that is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But I think that it would be a much richer environment if they had actors and people who could bring people back in time and really understand what an important time it was and how it has an impact on our time right now. Because I think that's one of the things that the Renaissance Fair does. We bring history to life, but we also make people think about their own lives and think about what's going on in their lives. At least I like to think that that's what we do.
One of the things I really like about the fair in that it really feels like a village with not necessarily actors, but you
Mhm.
have people just spontaneously being peasants or being nobles or being middle class. They've had the workshops, but aside from the stage shows, no one is working off a script. They're just being peasants. And to work or to play at the fair, you basically have to accept three premises of the fair. It's market day, so people are here to buy stuff.
Right.
Secondly, the queen's coming, so you're going to say, God save the queen.
Right.
And third, and this I think comes from Phyllis and Ron and all those folks, but everybody's there to have fun. And so that the audience comes to the fair primed to play. How do you think the fair makes itself seem like a village as opposed to something that is observed like Williamsburg?
It's complex. I think that having all strata of society looking at that is really a helpful thing. But I also think that making things unusual, giving the audience something that they say, they have music going on here. We don't always have that. We don't have it as a general rule as we're walking down the street. And so this is a different place. And so as they see the differences, they can kind of get themselves to be immersed in it because they can recognize it. But it's also a new thing. So they kind of move in. But I also think that what's very interesting about the fair is that there is street stuff going on. And I love the street stuff, but I actually prefer the stage stuff. And we have all of that at the fair. We have stage acts being the queen in the court, even though anybody can see her and anybody can see the court. It really is more of a stage because it's kind of a protected area and she's on stage or she's in the glade and so you can play to the crowd, the people on the street. The crowd can actually watch the people in the street live their own lives. And so I think they become more comfortable as they're watching things on the stage. That's something that people can understand because they've seen things on the stage. But then the fact that then they're surrounded by it all, I think makes people much more comfortable and then makes them think, what would it be like if I were in this situation?
One of the themes of this podcast has been for the performer, the difference in feeling when you perform in a staged written production versus on the street improv with a patron.
So
So
did you like street or stage better?
personally, I like the street
Okay.
because I liked establishing the one-on-one contact. To veer a little into the similarities between librarianship and fair, a street improv is like a reference interview. You start with, you know what you're saying, you establish sort of a rapport with the person, and you know sort of what the end of it looks like. And everything in between is just a negotiation and a sharing between the patron and the librarian because you share and create something together.
I
Um,
think I admire in fact, the person that I went to Williamsburg with, she loves street theater. And so she and a guy who's playing Shakespeare in some of the shows, Don Hardy, who you may or may not know, his first year as Shakespeare, he was nervous because he was a stage actor. And so she walked him through and they would stop and they would talk to someone and she said, no, I think your best play is Coriolanus or something that no one, rarely people have heard of. And so he would say, no, I think it's something. And so then she would get the audience to respond and to say what's the best and have you heard of and la la la. And then they would do it like every few feet or something, and it got him much more comfortable with the street work. But she adored that stuff and I think it's admirable, and I would be terrible at it.
so I guess that answers my next question is, as you evolved in the fair, did you ever spend much time on the streets?
Not much. When I first started, I was in St. Patrick's, the Irish Guild, don't you know? And I was assistant guildmaster. I was the person who was our liaison to the front office because there were a bunch of us and nobody could figure out how to get their pay stub in, I mean, or their little food ticket, right? Nobody could figure out how they got fed. And so I said, okay, I can do that. That's an easy thing. When I walked in, they said, what do you do? And I thought, what a good question. And he said, well, I need a paperwork person. I said, I can do that. And then at the end of that year, I was the assistant guildmaster. And
Congratulations.
well, yeah, because Don was fabulous, but didn't much care for paperwork. So I was always on the march. I was
Mhm.
either marching to stage or I was marching to the office, or no, I always looked busy. I had
Talk to me about who was who in the clan when you were there and what fair lessons did you learn from them?
Don Ferdinand was the guildmaster, and he was also the O'Neill. And when I started doing the fair, Ireland was, it was still in that very difficult time. I honestly think management was a little nervous about having the Irish and the Scots because everybody was big. There were St. George was a large guild, but the Irish was a large guild. We had probably 70 people, 80 people, something like that. And the Scots also then were down toward the front of the road. And so suddenly there were all these Celts and there was stuff going on, and Braveheart was coming out. And so people were a little nervous. So it was an interesting time in real history. And then because I had Irish family, I always thought that Queen Elizabeth was like not really a good person, which is ironic these days. And so I had done a lot of research when I heard about this O'Neill person. So then I went off to the library, of course, and did research and found out that he was a really interesting fellow. And Don was perfect. He was perfect. He looked like the cover of the book just called The O'Neill. Don looked exactly like him. And he had been away for a couple of years, but he had come back. He also, and you may not want to include this, but he also was dating Kat Taylor, he was dating Kat Taylor and then had broken up with her. And so I arrive as he's back in business and he has broken up with Kat and no one wants to talk about it, because internal fair politics and that sort of thing. And I don't know, I was at Rosie's. What was interesting was at Rosie's, I could watch the Cardiff Rose, who were the sword fighting guild, and I could watch the Irish. And it turned out when I got into the Irish that there was a lot of cross dating.
Mhm.
Now I was married, so I wasn't dating or anything like that. And my bachelorette party was at the fair, which was amusing, I must say, before I started working the show. So Don was a big character, and he also had good relationships with the queens, all of them. Will, he had a good relationship with Will. So Don had great relationships. And then eventually, a couple of years later, one of the women in the group decided that she wanted to be Grace O'Malley. So we had a Grace O'Malley and she could march through, and some of our guys would march with her. We had a great stage show, and there was dancing and there was singing and there was emoting and there was comedy, and which was nice.
Two things. One, that is another theme of this podcast, is that the fair being such a bottom up organization, you
Mhm.
can rise and sort of do whatever you want just by sort of raising your hand and or
Totally.
just doing it. Or, it's just like, oh, you can do that? Great.
Or do you need help doing that?
Yeah.
I can help you do that. I think that that is a lot of the spirit of the fair too. It's not ambition, run riot, and I need to be on that main stage. And I mean, there's some of that, of course, but I think a lot of it was, well, let's put on a show, Judy, and or Phyllis, and let's put it all together. And it's interesting. I was there just as Robin Driscoll was administration, but she was also a fabulous performer, and she handed the reins of the Sea Dogs to Steve at the beginning when I was just getting started, and I thought that was an admirable thing to do. But she was a terrific guildmaster, and he always was as well.
How were you introduced to what is being period at the fair mean? And what were those lessons you learned that stuck with you as, okay, what is period? What is too
Mhm,
far not period?
mhm.
And, where's the line and how do you internally navigate it?
My first introduction, I didn't know how I was going to get a costume. I was used to you have a part and someone gives you a costume. You don't have to make your costume, and the show opens in 3 weeks. So, how do you make your costume? What is that all about? And what kind of shoes do you wear? And I have to say, the Irish were not terribly instructive about stuff like that. I think 2 weeks before we opened, they said, so what are you wearing? And I thought, what? So I got out my sewing machine and I got some green fabric and I made a horrible costume, just a horrible costume, but nobody complained and nobody threw me off the lot. There was no costume mistress, as I recall, that we had to go through to get approved. And it got better periodically when I finally realized what I had to do. But what they were good at is giving us resources about who was the O'Neill and what were the politics, both in Ireland and why would we be in England at the time? Why would this be something that we might do? And they said, he was in England while he was growing up. So they gave us the lines of research, but they also gave us security lines that we knew that we were there for a reason. It wasn't just they were kind of, trying to throw everything Renaissance in at the same time. I think that there's got to be a through line somewhere, and there could
Right.
be hidden things like, yes, the O'Neill is there to salute the Queen and that sort of thing, but we also knew that we were trying to sell things so that we could get more weapons at home.
How were you exposed to BFA?
Class, I had to audition. It was one of those years when they actually had auditions to be actors. And so we had a lot of classes, and the BFA was certainly there. But I've been in Shakespeare shows, Taming the Shrew when I was in high school. I was The Tempest. I was, Shakespearean language was not unfamiliar to me. And I remember someone came over to my apartment. There were a few of us, and he thought that he was going to teach us how to do this stuff. And honestly, the people that I was with had been in Shakespeare shows before, and we were better than the guy who had been doing the fair for a couple of years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, was. I think he had some lessons that day too. These days, what we do in court, we try to remember these and thous and things like that. But in terms of gradations, if you can't remember BFA, at least you can remember not to use contractions. And you can remember to use words that people might not hear on a daily basis. So there are gradations of how you can get fair language and how you can learn it. And I don't think anybody has to be terrified that they don't have BFA memorized. I also think that as long as you sound a little different, that's enough. And then depending on your audience, depending on how long you have them, then you can kind of segue into something else.
And I'm going to segue a little bit. Were you ever typecast as in high school? Were you like the Wiley sidekick or the ingenue, or what was your lane in high school?
It depends. If it was a musical, I was in the chorus, or I was in Guys and Dolls, for example. I was the sexy voice on the plane from Cuba. But I was
Interests
Elizabeth
include.
in the Crucible. So,
Okay.
it kind of depended on, and then I was the understudy in Taming the Shrew for Kate, and tried not to pray that she would get sick, and she did not get sick. So I was the widow who married one of Petruchio's friends at the end, but I knew the lines. I knew the lines. But usually these days,
Mhm.
people do typecast as queens, as strong women characters, which is very flattering.
Say it's a Sunday after fair and you go into a 7-Eleven to get your Slurpee.
Mhm.
Do you exude a regal air?
No, no.
You can
Um,
turn it off and turn it on kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. First year that I did a Patterson production, the Heart of the Forest, I was the queen at Heart of the Forest. St. George was taking down their tent at the end of the day, and there had been we were singing, the Sea Dogs were doing some stuff, and so I was singing with them. I was out of my queen's outfit, of course, but the Sea Dogs were singing, and then the show was over, and so we all changed our clothes, but I went and I started helping St. George tear down the tent. Many of them were shocked. Many of them who had been St. George previously were shocked that I was doing that. And so I do that all the time. I'm part of the group, and so I help put up the tent and take down the tent. And so the beer is in the pickup truck, just not for me.
Take me through your career path from being the paper lady from the Irish to working through the court to become the queen.
Not through the court. No, I just sort of helicoptered in. So I was paperwork. And then as we were all leaving Black Point, Don and I sat down with, I think maybe it was Leslie and Kevin at that point. And Don said, I am not going to the fair in Vacaville. I'm retiring and I'm moving home. And so I'm not going to be the O'Neill. But I think Deborah should be the guildmaster. You guys make the decisions, but I would suggest Deborah as the guildmaster. And so I became the guildmaster after we left Black Point, and so was at Vacaville for 2 years, and I played Grace O'Malley. And then the Pattersons started the Santa Barbara Fair, and St. Patrick's was tired of the heat in Vacaville and said, let's go with the Pattersons. So I think there was some discussion about Gilroy, but we thought that Santa Barbara would be fun. And so we went to Santa Barbara. And I also was singing at that point in a trio. I was singing with Robin Driscoll and Tanya and Gita. So we were a blonde, a redhead, and a brunette. And we were the Blame It on Eve. That was our group name, Blame It on Eve. So, but the first year of Santa Barbara, St. Patrick's went down. And so got to know a lot of people, sang in the group. And then how did it go? And then Dickens started. So there was also this is all very complex, but the railroad fair. So that was a big deal because then all kinds of people were there. And so the Ladies Oratorical and Recreational Society, which was Lore's at the Dickens Fair, was just getting started again. And Robin recruited me to be in the show. So we were performing at the Sacramento show, and they were just getting ready to launch Dickens again. And while I was in Sacramento, someone who was entertainment director, the artistic director for the Folsom Renaissance Fair, which was trying to build a new main library. Or a new library in Folsom. That's what that fair was all about. So the guy who was the entertainment director and I were friends, and he said, golly, you have a high forehead. And I said, well, thanks, Dan, at dinner. And he said, no, you could be the queen. And I said, what? And he said, we might need a new queen soon. And I said, yeah, fine. And it was Sandy who ran the middle class at Black Point. And so I said, I love Sandy and I can't hurt her feelings. So I think I'm not going to be the queen without you talking to Sandy. If she decides to leave, then that's fine. So the next year, Sandy decided that her health was not good enough to allow her to be the queen. So I stepped into the queen role at Folsom Fair. And one of the queens at Black Point had come from the Folsom Fair too. So there were all kinds of intersections. So Dickens launches, and they did the Heart of the Forest Fair the first year without a queen. They thought a queen was inconvenient and nobody really cared, and maybe it was time to downplay the royalty. But they had Victoria at Dickens. So the first year goes by, there's no queen. They get complaints from the audience, or they say, golly, it's nice to have a queen, right? So the word kind of spread through the group, and someone came up to me at Dickens and said, a little bird told me that they will be looking for a queen next year, and I think you should audition. And so I thought, all right, I've been queen before, I can do this. So I wrote a note to Phyllis. And I said, I hear la 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 la. And I never would do that, but I thought it would be a really interesting thing. And I loved the Heart of the Forest. And we were, and my trio, we were singing there. So we were going anyway. And the queen only was on for a couple hours. And so you do something and then you're the queen and then you do something else. But I wrote a note. And so the Pattersons invited me to have a family meeting. So I went out, I came up to Novato, and Phyllis was there, and Leslie and Will was there too. And
You brought your forehead?
what Phyllis loved, she said, you have the nose of Elizabeth. She loved my nose. And that was my audition. And they asked me if I rode a horse. And I had taken horseback riding lessons when I was young. And so I said, sure, of course I can ride a horse. But what I didn't know is I had to ride side saddle. So someone had to teach me how to ride side saddle when I rode into the Heart of the Forest Fair. So that's how I got there. St. George then was built they work with any APQ. They work with actors portraying the queen. I was just an APQ who marched in and,
How, as an actress, does it feel to helicopter into one of these smaller fairs as opposed to being a queen at one of the bigger fairs?
The big fair is different than the smaller fairs because I really can be right there with the people and they can see me. I'm not the goddess who is waving the beer. Yeah. And I was only on, we had a main stage show. So I ride in, get off, try not to put Michael's eye out with the pearls, march onto stage, do the stage show. And then we were in court for maybe, I don't know, an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, something like that. And people would watch and we would have some things set up. I can't even remember whether I went to look at any of the vendors' booths or anything like that because it was a pretty tight thing. And I was also always scheduled for something else. I was in a production of Midsummer one year, and then the trio, we were singing for a couple of years also. So there was always something to do.
When you're approaching the role of the queen, do you recall other queens and what they did? And do you actively borrow from what they did? Or what traits of previous queens have you adopted and or admired?
So I saw three other queens.
Okay.
Thina, oh, help me.
For me, my queen was Louisa Puig.
That's right.
Yes.
My husband still thinks Louisa is the queen. Did you ever take a class from her during workshops?
Yes.
She was fabulous. Fabulous. Well, Louisa, I was never interested in the queen and what was going on in the court until Louisa, because it was the big celebration and, and that sort of thing. And Gloriana, and she was just so perfect going by over the
Yeah.
crowd. So perfect. So the things that I take from Thina are the lessons that she taught us during workshops, frankly. I do not have the white face on because mostly I'm in the smaller shows. And so people are right there. And it would be, I think, inappropriate to have that royal face in the face of the crowd as I'm walking down the street. If I'm going to be that present for them, then I have to be present, not in that makeup. I mean, I wear very pale makeup and look royal, but I don't do that. But she was so impressive, and her relationship with Will, because I had the chance to work with Will a couple of times. I worked with him as Drake, but then also at Dickens, I was Mrs. Everard in Naughty Postcards with him. So we were married. And so that was kind of interesting. And then the other queens, one of the queens,
Can I raise my
I think
hand?
it was,
You
sure,
said a theme when you're talking about walking in white face. Did you mean Louisa?
I don't remember saying anybody's name, but
Who were
Louisa
you
was the one who
referring
was
to when you just gave me that antidote? I'm sorry, I was confused.
Louisa, I remember, was the always wore the white
Right.
face. And because she was above the people, I think that that really worked. And I did not have white face when I was at Heart of the Forest, even though I was riding in on the horse. It just didn't seem to be, because it was in the country and, and that sort of thing. And so it was less formal, I think, than the Black Point court was. And then the other queens, Athena, I think, Athene danced. She and Robert Young danced and danced and danced and would fight with each other and things like that. So Rydell has usually been my Lester. And
Mm.
so occasionally, we will use that. We're going to march into court and we're not going to speak to each other. We're going to make everybody talk to each other for us. Tell my Lord Lester, blah, 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 blah. Tell Her Majesty, blah, 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 blah. And so I saw that there. But honestly, I think that everybody is different, and it really is a different, and she was such a complex character that you can find all kinds of things. She, in terms of religion, she really wanted everybody to have their religion in their hearts, and she didn't really like all the stuff that was happening, I don't believe. And so then I can look at that and I can think of my Irish Catholic background, and say, okay, well, she wasn't, until the very end, she wasn't that mean to the Irish, which of course she was, but mostly it was the guys who wanted the land because they weren't at war, so they had nothing to do, so they needed more land.
What characterizes your characterization of Elizabeth that's maybe different from your predecessors?
When I think of the characters that I play, I need that motivation. I need that. So, what is the thing that drives that character? And so, when I first started playing her, I believe The West Wing was still on. And Martin Sheen's tagline always was, "What's next?" And so that is how my character is driven. I want to know what's next. I always have one foot forward because I'm watching and I'm moving, and I also want to see what my people want. So what is next for England? What is next for us? That is how my character is driven. And, she also is a selfish bitch and complains and yells and throws things and stuff like that. But basically, she loves England and she wants it to succeed.
If I were to do this interview with a queen 5 years from now,
Mhm.
what do you do now that you hope is seen and incorporated into her Queen Elizabeth?
Listening and watching the audience. It's very interesting to engage the audience and then watch for the thing that they respond to. And it's street theater. when I'm playing her, we're in a kind of a small area. We have some seats, they can sit down. If there's a conversation, though, we take it out to there is no rope. But if there was a
Right.
rope, it would be to the rope and engage them in conversation. And I think that one of the things that we're losing sometimes in fair is there are a lot of booze, or there are some guilds that they go to amuse themselves and they go to dress up, but they're less engaged with the audience. And that's what we're there for. Do SCA if you're only interested in dressing up in the outfits, but engage the audience. And I think that making sure that we make a connection between what was going on during that interesting time and our time, because it is so interesting. We're trying to get off the planet. They were trying to get off the European continent. They were trying to find a way around the world. We're looking at that too. There was religious conflict. There is religious conflict today too. There is all kinds of interesting things, and we can make the match. We can help people think about it. Are there lessons in history that are good lessons? Are there history lessons that are bad? And I hope that continues and even gets better as we go.
Can I give you a semi-improv situation and see what you do?
Sure. Edit what you don't like.
But anyway, it's like 9:30 or 10. It's in the morning. Fair is just opened, and you're at the back of the fair. You're dressed like you're middle class. I mean, nothing says I'm the queen.
Mhm.
So it's really quiet, and it's actually cool. And there's a family of four coming up the road.
Mhm.
There's a father, a mother, and there's like a 7-year-old girl, and she has just purchased a garland. There's a
Mhm.
5-year-old son. He has a new Robin Hood hat, and he has a wooden sword. They
Mhm.
kind of look at you, and it's like they kind of want to play, but they're not going to be the first one to say anything, but they really, the feeling, you've
Mhm.
seen it 100
Sure.
times.
Mhm.
What do you do?
I greet them. I say, "Give you good day." And we have little cards that say, "You are invited to meet Her Majesty the Queen at 1:30 of the clock." And so it's a little card with a little rose, a little Tudor rose on it. And I would certainly say something probably to Robin Hood about, uh, you, you Robin Hood.
So the
And then I
mom
might give
takes your card, she reads
mom
it,
takes my card.
and
Mhm.
she says, "Oh, look, honey, do you want to go see the queen later?" The little girl grabs her mom's leg and peers around. And then the boy sort of he's not being threatening, but it's more sort of look at my sword kind of thing. What do you say?
Mhm. Mhm. I would say, "Oh, you should show Her Majesty how you use that sword."
And then
Um,
the little girl sort of peeks around and she shows you her garland. It's kind of like, look at this.
what a pretty garland you have. Where did you get that, child?
And she points down the road.
I would probably say at that point, you are already enjoying your lovely day at the fair. I trust you will enjoy it, and then move on.
Very good. Okay.
But
They
but
move on
again,
and they remember that they got invited to see the
right,
queen, and
that's right.
she got to show off her garland and he got to show off his sword, and life is good.
That's right. That's right. And with a wink at the parents, but they get the card, so
Do you really have a card?
yes,
Oh, what a good
yes,
idea.
we do. We have because I don't like to be Santa Queen.
Hmm.
When you're in a smaller fair, the parents and the kids, if people aren't paying attention, they sort of march up, and it would be an all-day thing. So we organize all of the children, and I go off stage for about 5 minutes, and they teach the children how to curtsy and how to bow,
Hmm.
and then they teach children a song. So then I come marching out, and everyone says, "Oh, God save the Queen!" And they sing for me, and they stand up, and they either curtsy or they bow, and then I always have a ribbon for them, pretty little ribbon with a Tudor rose button with a pin. And so then they come up, and I ask them what their name is and ask them to curtsy or bow again and give them the ribbon and sometimes have a conversation. And then they toddle on their way. And usually, because often I'm at the small fairs, if they've got their cameras up, then I turn the child around and they can take a picture with their kid and the queen.
Talk to me about who's made your dress.
Victoria Ridenour. Victoria Ridenour has been a costumer for a long time, and she was hired by the Heart of the Forest, by the Pattersons, to create my dress for Heart of the Forest. Before that, another friend got a regular pattern, a simplicity pattern or something like that, and made me my first dress, which it was beautiful. It was not as fancy as it should have been. I knew nothing about it, and no one gave me any advice or information. And mercifully, this sounds awful, but mercifully, the first show that I was queen, I walked in and the artistic director said, "Where's your court?" And I said, "What do you mean, where's my court? I thought there was a court here." And he said, "No, no, you're supposed to bring your court." And so we scrambled around to find people who could actually, suit up and were court, but were there just to have fun. And so we marched in, and it was a pretty small crowd. And then the heavens opened up. And so they opened up at about 11 o'clock in the morning, and everybody said, "Oh, it's going to be fine." And then it was not fine. And so the customers fled, and it was a downpour, a deluge. And nobody really saw my dress because I had just walked on as the heavens opened up. And Linda Underhill was still alive. So Linda Underhill and a number of people, and I think Molly may have been there or something like that. But so there was the performers, it was just us listening to the rain on the tent. And all the women had their skirts wide open on the floor. We were just all sitting there. There was color everywhere. And we had music, and the rain was there, and no one saw the dress that was inappropriate, and no one saw that there was no court. And then the next year we did it better. And then when I did the Patterson Fair, Victoria made me that dress. And then she has made all of my dresses subsequently. And not just for the Renaissance, but for Dickens also. So she's great. She's wonderful. And then she disappeared for several years because she was making costumes on a ship for all the actors who were doing stage shows on a cruise ship, which was lots of fun.
I'm going to pivot now to the question with which I started this podcast, which was, how have you used skills acquired at fair in your non-fair life? And if you could take a moment to describe your non-fair life, that would be fine.
My non-fair life, I have been involved in marketing. I mentioned Dolby before, and I also mentioned that I got sober. After I got sober, I started working with libraries. I started volunteering at the Friends of the Library in San Francisco. And one thing led to another. And I was the executive director of the Friends. I was board chair. And I have then got a library degree, was the president of the California Library Association, the president of a division of the American Library Association. And while I have been also in corporate life a research manager and have been very interested in information, it's the advocacy that I find very interesting. It's fighting for funding for public libraries, fighting for funding for intellectual freedom, fighting for the freedom to read. My experience at Fair, and especially my experience as the Queen, has allowed me just to be able to take stage and to be firm in what I say and relate to the audience. I can say what's next, but I can look like I am a figure of authority, and I am a figure of authority. And it's also allowed me to, in terms of, you're only a broad in a big dress if the people around you don't believe that you're the queen. You're only an executive director if everybody believes in what you can do and everybody believes that you're moving in the right direction. And so learning how to working with cast members, working with stage folks, working with backstage, on stage, and the audience is something that we have to do always in real life. And it's been very helpful for me.
What have you learned about communication at fair that you have applied to your work in library land?
Know
Yes?
when to quit. That's the thing. There's a beginning, a middle, and end, and often I find that some of our colleagues don't know when to quit. They don't know when to exit. So in Washington, I go to Sacramento and Washington and on advocacy trips for the American Library Association and for California Library Association, that sort of thing. And the library handouts used to be about 7 pages long, and there'd be a letter from this and a this and a this and this. And now in the last few years, we actually have a one sheet. These are the points that you need to make. You do not need to. Don't give the history. Don't give this is what we want. This is what we need funding for. This is why. It's a lesson always. And I think we do it at the shows too. Get off. Say what you need to do, get the laugh or get the sob and get off.
Or give them a little token saying, come back to the court glade at 1:30 and meet the queen. I mean, it's all part of the same process. I'm sort of running out of words to say, so when you were kind enough to say yes to doing this interview, was there something in your head that said, I have to be sure to mention so and so and such that you haven't mentioned yet?
What a good question. I think crossing the line from and working at Rosie's was lots of fun, but crossing the line and then getting back into acting, because I had been out of acting for a while, was it was really a joy. And I sort of subsequently have split my time between library stuff and entertainment stuff, fair stuff, and or acting, theatrical work. And I have to say that it was such a joy to get back to it. I rarely met someone and rarely meet anyone in the fair world that is solely out for themselves. It is an ensemble. It is a group effort, and people are willing to hold their hand out to someone who is willing, just like that little girl who peeked around her mother's leg, just like that young boy with the sword. If there's willingness, then usually there is somebody there who will hold their hand out and say, are you more interested in this? What can I tell you? Would you like to step over the hay bale? Would you like to come work with us? And I also love that there are generations of us now who are still trying to bring history alive and trying to create that recognition in the audience that those people back there were very akin to us today. And we might want to be aware of what was going on then because it might have an impact on us now. And so I'm grateful for all of the people who went before and made the magic happen, and hope that we can continue to do so. I could name names. This is like any Academy Award speech, right? But if the Pattersons hadn't if the Folsom Renaissance Fair hadn't been there, if they hadn't been trying to raise money for their library, I wouldn't be have done what I've been doing for the last 20 years. But I also, the recognition among the people, we who do this stuff, is that we're very lucky to be able to do it too. Up at Folsom, when they actually got the library built, there's a curving hallway because it's an odd stretch of land. There's a curving hallway that goes, you walk into the front door and then it goes around a curved building. And so I said, the year that it was done, I said at the notes in the morning, I would love the progress to go to the library, to say hello to the library and welcome them into the new library. And I'm telling you, most of the performers were in that progress. And we had, the guys with the pikes. And as we approached the library doors opened and the pikes went down and we all marched through and we all gave a salute to the librarians. And I don't just say that because I'm a librarian and because I, love libraries and research. I think it was a real community salute. And we were so pleased that we had a part in making that library happen. And everybody was delighted that we were there too. And it was just a real moment of community. I think that's one of the things that the fair has always done for me. And even when I was, even when I was at my loneliest, even when I was drinking and trying and desperate, it wasn't any fun anymore. But I knew that at least people at the fair would understand because a number of them had been through it before. And so the fair is there are all kinds of people who can be, questionable, but it's a community that really does take care of its own and generations of its own, and that's what I love about it.
Well, I think that marks a good place to end this.
Sounds good.
Okay, let me hit the stop record.